And we're recording. Hello, anybody watching Future Generations. Hope the planet's okay, or at least marginally more okay than it is right now. This is the Philosophy Club here at CSUS. This is our nth official meeting. We've been doing this for a number of weeks. Today we have Professor Kyle Swan with us, Professor of Philosophy at CSUS, who's going to be doing the presentation, as I understand it, on socialism and how we're using that term in the American political discourse right now, or at any rate, in the years between like 2018 and 2021. So I don't have any real preamble or agenda for us here today. The normal format that I think we're going to stick to, I hope we're going to stick to, is that we're going to go through the presentation as normal, and then we're just going to do a discussion of it for the remainder of the hour we usually record for. And we may do stuff after that too. But yeah, that's all I've got really lined up for us today. So Professor Swan, if you're ready, please go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I'm gonna assume that folks had a chance to read the short essay at the link that was passed around. I'm going to raise some questions and issues that are definitely related. And any of the stuff that I talk about, any of the stuff that that's in the essay, definitely fair game for your questions or comments or criticisms. I guess it makes sense to start here. You know, often there's like an argument amongst people about politics where one side goes, well, you know, socialism is this and it would do this, and it becomes very clear very immediately that this isn't something that we should listen to very seriously. They're not arguing about something that we should really care about, and that's the reason is because they're arguing about something that isn't real. It's almost like they're arguing about unicorns. They're arguing for an imagined ideal. I know this because when you ask them, like, what country do you have in mind that is socialist in the sense that you like, they can't really point to anything, right? Because when you ask them that, they don't say, well, I mean Venezuela, or I mean the former Soviet Union. Those are both socialist countries. Typically, people don't hold these countries up, these examples up as exemplars of the kind of socialism that they would go in for. Rather, what they say is that, well, if we had real socialism, then this is what would happen. So they're not arguing about any existing or a place or country or even any country that actually ever existed. What they have in mind is an ideal. So now I go into this in the essay. Socialism here means a fully planned economy, right? That's the sort of socialism that the Soviet Union tried to be. It's the sort that Venezuela more or less tries to be. It's the sort that Cuba has very often more or less tried to be. North Korea is another example. And again, you can see why people wouldn't point to these countries, these places as exemplars. Things there go very, very badly for people. The conclusion that we should take from these examples in actual history, where they actually tried to implement a fully planned economy, is that socialism isn't feasible at scale. Try to actually fully plan an economy, and you'll get lots of misuse of society's scarce resources. You'll get lots of waste of those resources, and you'll get lots of poverty in those places. That's what we see. Now, here's a different question. It's not a question about whether we should have a fully planned economy. It's a question about whether or not we, like meaning our country, should move in a more socialist direction, right? So should we try socialism in the sense that it represents things that we're not currently doing? Should we move the bar? Should we move the meter in a socialist direction? And to answer that question, maybe we should have a benchmark, right? If maybe like we've got socialism, if state ownership and control over the direction of the means of production was something like more than half, maybe something like, it's just the arbitrary level, more than half of the country's GDP would be a substantial portion of the means of production. And should we have state ownership and control over that significant an amount? It would be a state ownership and control over what gets produced and what gets used in the production of various things, because obviously some goods are substitutable at certain levels. You could use commodity X to produce this thing that we need, or you could produce it using commodity Y or Z, or maybe 3 or 4 other things. So they would make all of those decisions. That is, the state would, government bureaucracy would. There would also be state control and direction over the prices of a range of things, like wages or interest rates or the actual prices of commodities. Now, the contrast in like a more capitalistic system, in a system where markets happen. Markets determine all of these questions about the direction, the allocation, and production of different kinds of things that we need. Markets, a competitive market system, determines price levels of different things. Now, again, there's no existing system like this either, where markets do it all. But the question is whether, the question isn't whether there's an existing system like it, but it's like whether we should try to be more like one end of the spectrum or the other. You've got a choice between more or less centralized economic decision-making versus decentralized economic decision-making. Decentralized economic decision-making uses mostly competitive market prices to make those decisions. Centralized economic decision-making uses politicians and bureaucrats to make those decisions. So, so here's an argument against making things more socialistic in those terms. The thing that makes socialist systems perform so badly is the very thing that it tries to eliminate the price mechanism. Again, when there is state ownership and control over the society's scarce resources, then markets don't determine how things are allocated. Rather, these people do. The problem is these people don't know enough about how to allocate these resources. They have to do it one way or another. They end up doing it badly. They end up doing it in a way that produces massive resource waste, massive resource misallocation, production of things that people don't want or don't need, and a lack of things that people do want and do need. It's just because they're not using a competitive pricing system to figure out what people want and what people need. Here's the thing that we know. It's pretty well confirmed, that's understating. One thing that we know about economics is that using a competitive market system is the best way that we've hit upon, the most efficient way that we've hit upon for allocating scarce resources, answering questions about the direction and allocation and production. The thing about competitive market prices is that they represent all the opportunity costs of using this thing for one thing rather than another. That information is encapsulated in this index of relative prices so that I can see that it makes more sense to use this for this production project that I have in mind rather than using this other thing for that production process. And what tells me which one to use is that the fact is that the price for this is lower. I can achieve the same goal in terms of the production process by using this, and it costs less. The fact that it costs less than this just means that there are more people who want or need this for lots of other things. If it were used for this other thing, when something else was just as good or substitutable, instead of these other things that are bidding its price up, then it wouldn't be available for those things. And accordingly, the resource would be misallocated. That's what produces the waste. But we have these little handy dandy price signals that help us avoid those problems. Doesn't work perfectly, but it works better than any other way that we've hit upon for making these decisions. It certainly works better than leaving those decisions to somebody who sits in an office working for the government. I'm going to switch gears now. I'm going to tell you a story. It's a kind of like a, I guess it's like a parable. Sometimes it's called the parable of the emperor's singing competition. And it goes like this. Once upon a time, the emperor wanted to have a singing competition. And there are two contestants, let's say, for the sake of simplicity. And the first contestant comes on the stage, sings a song. Didn't go very well. It worked out it went pretty badly, in fact. And so the emperor says, I've heard enough. I will award the prize of the singing competition to the second contestant, because no way the second contestant could be worse than the first one. Now look, every side does this, makes this mistake. The mistake, of course, is that the second contestant actually could do worse. What each side does in this sort of political debate is they look at the problems in the other side and they reason like this. It's the reason that their side should win. They say, look at the problems of government bureaucratic decision making in North Korea and Venezuela. Therefore, the market should do it instead. Or look at the problems of how markets work or don't work, sometimes fail in the United States. Therefore, the state should do it. What both sides in this little stupid debate are doing is that they're comparing a flawlessly operating market with states that exist, like North Korea, and say, obviously, markets are better. Or on the other side, they compare an imagined ideal of how socialism works in theory and compares it with how markets function in the United States. And they say, therefore, the state should do it. Both sides, when they do this, are committing a fallacy. We can call it the unicorn fallacy. They're comparing their imagined ideal with actual existing states. That's a faulty comparison. What you should do if you're going to make comparisons is compare like with like. Compare ideal with alternative ideal, and compare actually existing societies with alternative actually existing societies to make your comparisons. If you're not making your comparisons that way, then you're committing the fallacy. Don't compare. So always keep in mind that this is a singing competition with two terrible singers. Right? For example, in actually existing quote unquote market-oriented free market societies, capitalist societies, capitalist firm CEOs make decisions based on short-term goals regarding the firm's profitability and its share price. Sometimes this leads them to make bad decisions with their resources. That's a bad singer. Here's the other bad singer. Government decision makers also make decisions based on terrible short-term goals regarding, I don't know, for example, what will get them reelected, or what will keep them in power, or what will enhance the budgets that they control. Capitalistic CEOs aren't informationally and morally perfect. Government bureaucrats are not informationally and morally perfect. You have to compare non-ideal with non-ideal. But for the technical economic reasons concerning why government planning concerning economic decision making is such a bad idea, and we shouldn't move things in that direction. But what should we be like? So we shouldn't be like the places where they've tried to fully plan an economy. What should we be like? And I want to say, well, we should be like Sweden. Is Sweden a socialistic country? Is it a democratic socialist country? I don't know, and I don't really care. If you think it is, if you think there's a kind of socialism operative in the so-called Nordic model of the kind of system employed in Sweden, Denmark, Finland, I'll say, fine, let's be socialistic in that sense. Now, as I say in the essay, people who say that we should be more like the Nordic countries, they typically radically underappreciate how market-oriented these Nordic countries are. Here are a couple of quotes. The Prime Minister of Denmark, I don't know his name, I didn't look it up. I probably couldn't pronounce it. He said, "The Nordic model is an expanded welfare state which uses capitalism to provide high level of security for its citizens. But it's a successful market economy with much economic freedom." If you look at these measures of economic freedom, I think I linked to a measure in the essay. You'll see that the United States by no means is a leader in economic freedom. Typically, I don't know what the last ranking says. Typically, the Nordic countries score higher than the United States on that scale. I think certainly Hong Kong, I think, scores the highest on indices of freedom. New Zealand is pretty high. The United States, meh. So here's the story about, I'll just pick Sweden for an example. In 1990, Sweden had a very high percentage of its GDP controlled by state enterprises, state-owned and controlled enterprises. Also, at the time, they had quite low economic growth rates and uncompetitive industries compared with industries worldwide. They had a very high level of labor regulations that made the costs of labor really high as well. At the time, around 1990, they decided to implement a vast range of economic reforms. And now, as I said, in measures of protection of property rights, openness to trade, an independent and free stock market, lack of bureaucratic red tape in starting businesses, and so on, Sweden scores very high in terms of these measures of economic freedom. And from that time on, from 1990 and on, Sweden got wealthier and wealthier. They started to look more like the Sweden that we see today. Now, of course, this increased levels of income inequality there. Currently, Sweden has less income inequality than ours. This is, but only because their safety net is more generous than ours. Pre-government transfer, our inequality levels aren't very different at all. So it's only after the redistribution of certain resources that it corrects for certain, what would be about the same level of inequality. Now, Sweden, another result of these economic reforms is that, again, Sweden started doing very well. Currently, it has more billionaires per capita than the United States does. But of course, not only did their very well off folks start doing better off, but their lowest 20% of their income distribution, they started doing better and better too. And their rates of gain increased more than the rate of gain at the top end of the economic distribution. So the rich got richer as a result of these economic reforms, but the poor got poorer too, and at a faster rate. Actually, you see this in the United States too. One difference is that the poorest 20% in the US are still better off than the poorest 20% of, I think, all but one of the Nordic countries. About the same with Sweden, but the US poorest 20% are better off, have higher average consumption per person than the averages of all people in most countries of the OECD and Europe. So what that measure suggests is that you're better off being at the 20% of the income distribution level in the United States. That number is higher than the average for these European countries. But here's what's true about the Nordic countries. It looks like they used mostly capitalistic, markets. They used market policies that create a surplus that finances a very generous welfare state, a set of welfare policies. They do this, of course, by taxing much higher level and using a tax base that's much broader. Their middle class, for example, pays a lot higher percentage of their tax revenues than our middle class. Now you might be saying this, wait a minute, isn't Sweden a democratic socialistic country? Again, I don't know and I don't care. Most Swedes say, I don't know what you're talking about, we're a market economy. That was the upshot of the claim by the Prime Minister of Denmark. People, high-ranking officials in Sweden say the same thing. But look, if this is what you want, then I'm in favor of it. If you want something like, when you say socialism, and what you mean is capitalism with a better welfare state than we currently have, perhaps a universal basic income or something like that, then I'm right there with you. If that's, maybe it shouldn't be called socialism, maybe you can call it schmocialism. I'm an advocate of schmocialism. And I'm happy to answer questions about any of this stuff. Oh, that's generous. Thank you, Daniel, for clapping.
Right. Yeah, in lieu of a live session in person. Thank you, Professor Kyle Swan. That was interesting. Admittedly, I don't know if I may be the only one in this boat, but I've actually heard similar ideas expressed elsewhere. But I don't. So I'd love to sort of gauge opinion from the rest of the club as to
Yeah, I'd love to hear what people think.
How totally novel it is. Like how well into the discourse is this idea that like the thing we're calling democratic socialism in the United States isn't really socialist. Even Bernie Sanders' policies per se are not particularly socialist. Rex, I saw you had a hand raised a moment ago, but I don't know if you wanted to go with that.
Well, I guess on one hand, I'll agree. I think there's economic policies that aren't really socialist that we call socialist, and it's just buzzwords. Same thing with as Professor Swan puts it. Same thing with more liberal folks calling everything that is capitalism the exact opposite of failed capitalism of sorts. But my question was I came across this in a different course. If you see my comment.
No, I haven't seen a comment. Let me see if I can open this up.
But I'm wondering where would this fit along the lines of like modern economics? I'm thinking possibly it could be capitalist, could be socialist. But I think like when both reading the article as well as when you have both people on the right and the left wing pointing out certain abuses, what comes to mind is the ancient idea of meritocracy, where you pay people based on their merit to society rather than say think of like a LeBron James making hundreds of millions of dollars a year for playing basketball.
I mean, I don't know how you're using the word merit.
I guess I think
here's let me just be clear about how wage rates are determined in a market society. Generally, people are paid their marginal productivity. So if they produce a lot of value, then they are paid like something that indicates the value that they produce. So it's I don't know if that's what you mean by merit.
Essentially, I'm wondering like if
so the question is, yeah, good. So if you understand merit in terms of like how productive someone is, and if you measure how productive someone is in terms of a competitive pricing system, then you know, I mean, LeBron James seems to be paid appropriately. He generates a lot of value because a lot of people love to watch him play basketball and put a ball through a hoop. Many more people want to see him do that than they want to see me give philosophy lectures. That's why he's paid more than me. And of course, nobody wants to pay me anything to try to put balls in hoops. But I don't know if that's what you mean by merit, or if you meant something else.
Yeah, basically social value. I'm thinking, like, could you have a controlled definition on what that value is and a market economy?
That value, that level, is going to be the outcome of a process. It's not going to be something that you can determine ex ante. It's going to be determined by the millions, hundreds of millions of decisions that people make with their stuff, vying for the resources to have, to consume something that they want. So it's the outcome of like of a process rather than something that you can determine ex ante. So it's not like I can sort of say, here's a like a hierarchy of objective value, and like here is giving philosophy lectures, and here is skill in putting balls through hoops, and sort of have some kind of index that relates the value of these two so that I get paid more than LeBron James. If it were determined that way, then like I would have more money than I do and more money than James. But that's not how it's determined, right? The valuations are subjective. They're determined by people making decisions about what to do with their local knowledge and local resources, and how that gets translated into, crystallized into a price. A wage rate is just a market price for labor. So LeBron James's wages are determined through the exact same process that as the process that determined what the price of milk goes for.
If I may, I think my interpretation is like what Rex is getting at with the question about social value is that we have ideas in society about what kinds of things are good for society. We would probably, I think most people would say that like that being a philosophy professor is on like sort of like a slightly ephemeral, not ephemeral, but the sort of abstract intellectual sense, more valuable than playing basketball, however well those respective things might be done. And we'd probably also say that like resources should be allocated somewhat, or people have needs and deserve to have those basic needs met. Most people would say like nobody deserves to be homeless, nobody deserves to be to lack healthcare such that they die from treatable diseases and so on and so forth. We would say these things not as economic values, but as I suppose humanitarian values. And what is sometimes contended on the left, from I suppose probably full disclosure, my camp on the left, the Bernie camp, is that the market economy as such, the market economy even as it's sort of like mitigated by the state in the United States, often fails to conform to those values. It's sort of in that it allocates resources in this way that like such that, I don't know, it's not a bad example because I don't know how like bad a person LeBron James might be relative to someone else, but it allocates much more resources to LeBron James and much more resources to Jeff Bezos and much more resources to, I don't know, PewDiePie than it does to people who are arguably doing harder work that is better for society, and that it doesn't. So basically, yeah, so the market system, even in a regulated system, sometimes seems to totally disconnect from the sort of social value generated by certain kinds of labor. I suppose the question we sort of contend with in American politics right now is to what extent does central planning do that better? I suppose that'll probably be the meat of discussion, but also to what extent does this sort of welfare system, this sort of Rawlsian system that like Sweden particularly employs in the UK and so forth. There's more royalty. To what extent do those systems allocate resources more like social meritocracy than?
They do it pretty much like we do it. That was sort of the point of my opening remarks. They use markets to determine how, for example, CEOs get paid and how other workers get paid. It happens through a process of people like vying for resources and negotiating and sort of using things that they have to try to get things that they want. And that process sort of crystallizes into a price that indicates the way that society values the work that's being done. So if that's what you mean by social value, then that's what it does. Now, if you mean something different by social value, something that markets sort of fail to realize, if you worry about people who are left behind by this process, people who end up contributing very little in terms of marginal productivity, then what we do is that we say, we don't want people to live like that, and so we'll make their lives better. We're not, but what we're doing when we do that is we're not necessarily correcting for a market failure. What we're doing is we're saying things can be better for these people, and we have the resources to make it better for them. Let's do that, right? I think that, again, that's a good thing to do. I think that there are costs and benefits associated with doing it the way we do it in the US versus the way they do it in the Nordic countries. Again, their social safety net is a little bit more generous than ours, but the burden of those extra benefits, if you compare the two societies, seems to fall on the middle class disproportionately.
Yeah, and that's part of the substance of what we're talking about, is that whatever any system we come up with will not be perfect in at least some articulation.
Yeah, but here's what you don't want. Here's what you don't want. You don't want to get rid of markets, because again, this is the thing that's more confirmed by we know this at least as well as we know anything in the social sciences, that markets do this better. A competitive pricing system based on private ownership and voluntary exchange does that so much better than a system based on state ownership and bureaucratic management. That is demonstrably true. So you can call it correct for, or you can try to sort of make improvements for the least advantaged. Good thing to do, but you'll end up hurting the least advantaged most of all when you put the more resources you put under the control of the state, the more you get away from markets.
Yeah, that's one thing we can definitely take away from this, just for our the benefit of our political discourse, is that there is an enormous difference between a social safety net and a centrally planned system. To whatever extent those things may exist.
Excellent.
You can have like central planning that's like that's only in one sector of an economy and not another. And you can have
Well,
social
then you're
safety nets that are
going
bigger
to, then
and smaller.
that sector will operate badly at the
Right.
margin. But but yeah, I mean, I think that's the main lesson. Markets are your friend. Markets are the only thing that will provide the resources to have a social safety net that's adequate, and it's going to make it unnecessary for the overwhelming majority of society.
So I wanted to, well, we're getting towards an hour, but I feel like I've been talking too much. Does anybody
Yeah, let's hear
have any
let's hear from
remarks?
other people.
Yeah, I have a question.
Hello, Jared.
So you've defined socialism as state control of like the means of production. I'm
Yeah.
wondering if there is a distinction between central state control and if you could have a more democratic socialism or the workers' control. I don't know how that would peter out or in real life.
Well, I provided two definitions of democratic socialism in the essay. One is where you use democratic mechanisms to empower the state to in how it will direct society's scarce resources. That's the first one I think I listed. So in the old Soviet system, they didn't do that because there wasn't much real voting going on. What happened is that people who occupied government positions just made all the decisions. But you could imagine a different system where democratic mechanisms empowered and sort of set the marching orders for the people who represented the people. So the people would sort of prioritize what kind of projects, production projects, and which sectors of the economy to expand and how to allocate resources. That would work as bad as the system that actually operated in history. The second definition of democratic socialism is really one where there's markets all over the place, and we use the surplus of those markets to fund a very generous welfare state. That's the one I said, that's the one to go for.
Okay.
Now, I mean, there are worker cooperatives in the United States. There are corporations that are owned by employees. That's an option here. It's not a heavily utilized option. Some economists think for various reasons regarding efficiency, but mainly it's because of, I think, the legal environment will sort of exacerbate the inefficiencies of worker managed cooperatives. But what's true in those corporations is that those people are owners. And so it's part of a system where you have private ownership and control. It's part of a market society.
Okay, thank you.
The idea of a employee-owned corporation is sort of interesting, just because it sort of goes to show that you can have market systems where arguably people are not operating in accordance with like the immediate sort of rational self-interest that we generally associate with capitalist economics or market economics, I suppose.
Why do you think that? Why do you think that worker-owned corporations
because
don't care about profits?
Oh no, it's not that they don't, and not so much that they don't care about profits, but because it's that they, well, in theory, in my head, they're demonstrating something more like a humanitarian outlook on things, where they care about each other and the corporation as a whole, in better competition with how they care about themselves. In an ordinary corporation, you have a corporate ladder. An ordinary corporation, each one is a little bit different, but you have a corporate ladder, and in theory, everybody wants to be at the top of it, and they are willing, or at least they should be willing, to step on other people to get there. That obviously doesn't predict the results.
I don't know. Look, a corporation is just a particular type of legal entity where you have broad-based ownership among shareholders, where you've got lots of different people who own shares in the company, and those people use those shares to vote for a board of directors. Those board of directors hire or have a subcommittee of a management selection committee where they hire a CEO and other sort of higher level management types. And that CEO, what they're supposed to be really good at is making decisions on behalf of the shareholders. And they make hiring decisions, they make production decisions, they make marketing decisions based on the feedback from lower and mid-level management, but with an eye towards doing the thing that the shareholders want. The only thing that's different about a cooperative is that the shares are owned exclusively by workers. Everything else is the same. The shareholders, in this case the workers, will hire a management team, a CEO, who will make decisions. It could be like where you've got more in those places. Maybe the only difference beyond that is that there's more that the shareholders will have input on, because they're local and they have a keener interest than a typical shareholder does. Most shareholders of most corporations don't really even know what they own shares in, because it's part of a huge like mutual fund or retirement 401k plan. They don't know what's in it. They just look at the price of the shares and make this. But you might have something different among major shareholders in normal corporations and sort of in worker-owned corporations. They would be sort of there on the spot and maybe be better informed about about the doings of the CEO. But otherwise, they're run the same way.
Interesting. So not the cases of like direct democracy. But in any case,
direct democracy just gets too unwieldy when you have too big of an enterprise.
We have a couple hands raised in the chat. I believe we last heard from Rex. So Daniel, please go ahead. I don't know who was first to raise the hand.
Rex can go first.
Oh, okay. Daniel actually had his hand before me, and that's true. I did go last, but all right. Thank you.
All this deference to each other. That's so nice to see.
But yeah, I was just making note of my own comment, a bit of sarcasm, but Professor Swan, I think you missed one sort of democratic socialism, and that's where everyone lives in voluntary poverty. The only place it actually lasts long term, I think.
Yeah, this is probably not any place that exists, of course. Like, I mean, nobody wants to be poor, I would have thought.
Oh, monasteries, Professor, that's what I was referring to.
Oh, yeah, and look, if you have like I don't run my household like a market. Like, I don't hire my children as like employees in Swan Inc. or anything like that. This isn't, my household isn't run like a market. What we have is central direction. Like spouse and I make all the decisions about how to allocate our woefully scarce resources. But notice why we're able to do that. Notice why we can run the Swan family as a socialist sort of enterprise. One is that it's really tiny. There's only 6 of us. And another is that we can use the outside market and the price levels, the indices, the signals there to make decisions about how to internally direct our resources. We're not making these decisions in the dark. We can use information from the broader market to make really good decisions about how to allocate internal resources. So we're not divorced from the market, even though internal to the family, it's mostly central direction. Now, there's like an analogy here. One big puzzle about the Soviet Union was, how did they make the decisions that they made? How did they last as long as they did? One answer to that is that they beat people into submission. That's one way they did it. But they were also able to use world prices as very imperfect indicators of how they should direct their internal resources. That's why, even though the way they allocated their resources was woefully inefficient and led to lots of terrible poverty, it could have been worse if they didn't have those sort of shadow prices, if they couldn't construct shadow prices internally based on world resource prices. But yeah, monasteries are kind of neat, if that's your thing, and yeah, they make internal to the resources that they have under their disposal. They've got some head honcho that makes all the decisions. They're a small enough community that they're able to do that without leading to too much inefficiency. But of course, they interact with the world. Sometimes they sell stuff to the outside world. In history, at least, that's what they did. They offered services. They took alms. I don't know.
Okay, Daniel, I wanted to say something.
Well, I guess sort of a couple silly comments before I get to the actual point, because it's me. I'm not just gonna sit here and be serious all the time. One, I disagree with the notion, Professor Swan, that to see you, pay to like shoot a ball. I would pay very good money to see you go one-on-one with Professor Park. I think you could post him up, but he would probably have the quickness advantage on the perimeter. So it would be interesting to see who would win that one out. Like, I'd pay at least $2 to see that.
Yeah, I should get points. I should get spotted points. I should get odds.
And the second silly comment is like, in light of your household being, running a corporation or whatever, like I'm imagining the other members of the household like holding a vote. It's like, we are removing father duties from you. We have determined that we do not like these allocation of resources. And that just makes me smile. And so now I'm going to make it my goal, my mission in this last 1 week of Zoom school to be like, hey, other members of the Swan household, start a coup. Start a coup. He's vulnerable. Now on a more substantive note, my actual thoughts on capitalism, socialism, economics, all this sort of stuff are far too complicated to get in here. It gets into ethics and human psychology and then things of that nature, and we don't need to. And they're still formulating in the first place, and we don't need to hear Daniel sort of try to read off his grand treatise on the nature of and everything. But one thought that does cross my mind is I don't know what you would call a single payer healthcare system other than, sort of this idea of sort of central control, state run, all those decision makings. And it seems at least a very popular notion that such a system is better in the ways we want to, and that there are certain people who would argue that it is less wasteful. It gets what we're wanting to. Less money is spent on healthcare in that sort of system, and so at least in that regard, does that not poke a little bit of notion like, okay, like at least in this one aspect of things, like William was making a notion of, like certain sectors being centrally run and others being better not centrally run. Does this not present a problem along those lines?
Yeah, I mean here's would be like a ranking of like my preferences, like sort of a market in healthcare according to like that ran according to a competitive price system. That would be first. Second would be single payer of the sort that like the UK or Canada has. Third would be the actual system that we have in the United States, which managed to put together the worst of both of those systems. I can now even though let me just mention some costs and benefits of my ranking of 2 and 3. Even though in the end, I think 2 is better than 3, that is, a single payer system is better than the system that we have. You will be giving up a lot if you went for it. One thing that's different, one thing that's obviously better in our system than in places with socialized medicine is that the innovation is so much better here. We have newer, better procedures, toys, drugs, things that make people better. That would stall in a single payer system.
Then the notion of innovation actually ties into a lot of my complicated feelings about economics and things of that nature. But I guess to sort of follow up on this, then, like obviously we know what changes people want to make to get a single payer system in there. They want there to be a single payer system, but like what would a market-driven system, like how would it look differently specifically than from the weird system that we've got right now? What would be notably different?
Yeah, one is that there'd be there would be a lot more competition. There would be more physicians. There would be more things that non-physicians could do. You wouldn't need to see a medical doctor for a checkup. You could go to someone who was some kind of licensed practitioner. So basically, the costs would go down for most of the things that we use the medical system for. There would still be a market for third-party insurance, but it wouldn't work like our system works, where it's tied to your employment, and it's super expensive, and it covers everything, almost everything, even very low cost, heavily used items and procedures and services. The whole point of insurance is to cover sort of foreseeable but rare events. But when you have a third party that pays for almost everything, that's considered a medical service, and that's what most insurance policies do, then it makes the costs go up. A third-party payment system tends to be much more costly. Now, why do we have a third-party payment system tied to our jobs? I can tell you a story about that from US economic history. It has to do with a government policy that at a time implemented wage and price controls, tamping down on increases in wages. There was basically a law that said you can't pay these people, these workers, more than X amount of dollars. And so since corporations or companies and firms weren't able to compete for good labor by offering people more money, they started offering them benefits, in-kind benefits. Health insurance was one of them. So you get this we get sort of trapped into this system of third-party payments, of an insurance policy that's tied to your employment, and they cover everything, even relatively foreseeable and commonplace services. That's a recipe for huge increases in prices over time.
Okay, we have one more hand in the chat. Please go ahead, Jared.
I was just going to ask about, like, if we agree that free markets are a better economic system for, like, reducing poverty, are there still other, like, ethical considerations we should take into about how capitalism can prioritize more materialistic, profit-based incentives? Are there any arguments we should consider in that realm?
Let me address your comment in the chat first about Hayek. You're referring to an economist, mid-20th century economist, Friedrich Hayek, who definitely was in favor of a universal basic income. And of course, open borders. Now, the weird thing you said is, despite being a champion of free markets, open borders is obviously a free market policy. It's saying that anybody can live anywhere, can take a job anywhere. It reduces an artificial barrier to entry into a labor market from people who happen to have the bad luck to be born in other places that are really poor. So a border wall and restrictive immigration policies is a way of the government managing who lives where and the labor market. This is most free market economists say that the system of these artificial barriers to entry come at a cost of an entire world's product. So if you add up all the GDPs of every country in the world, it comes to about 75 billion. World GDP would be double that in a world with no restrictive immigration policies. More people would be so much more better off without them, because they would have access to markets. I'm not sure what you mean about other values. I mean, one way of identifying the value the value secured by markets is a value of efficiency. If you care about efficiency, you should care about markets. A proxy for that, of course, is how well people do. So if you care about rising living standards, if you care about poor people not being as poor, then you should care about markets. If those things count as ethical values, then markets secure ethical values. There are other ethical values that markets secure, something like the benefits associated with voluntary exchange. Market-oriented societies tend to I mean, there are these like sort of lab tests that sort of kind of indicate, there are social science laboratory experiments that show that there's a whole slate of cooperative values associated with like cooperating with each other, that people who were born and raised in market societies have, that people born in more collectivist societies tend to do worse in approximating. So there's all kinds of values that are on display in market-oriented societies. What are the ones you're worried about the most?
Well, it's not something I've fully thought through. What I had in mind was more just valuing things in terms of profitability, like even things.
All profit means is that the person who earns a profit provided a service or a good that lots and lots of people valued. Bill Gates is super duper wealthy. It's about to be cut in half, by the way. Careful. But he's super duper wealthy because he made lots of stuff that lots of people value and improved and used to improve their lives. In a market society, you get wealthy by serving other people. In places where they didn't have markets, I'm going to use the S word, the socialist countries like the former Soviet Union, people got rich by standing on the necks of the serfs.
I have two comments. The first is that, well, actually I have three comments. The first is that we are running into the 8:20s. So if anybody has anywhere to go, there's no way for me to hold it against you anyway, but I wouldn't hold it against you even informally if you had to go somewhere.
We should make this one the last one, I think.
Well, in that case, the other thing is that the other two things I wanted to make sure I say to somebody ever is that another important distinction we can take away from this discussion is that there's a huge difference between not only like central control and welfare, but also between capitalism and republicanism in the United States. Like there is it's never been the case that like a political party is completely like consistent with its purported immediate values. Like Republicans will of course say they love free markets, but
you're talking about reality, the political party.
Borders. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, like republicanism.
Terrible people. Terrible people.
Some I assume are good. Anyway.
Awful. You're kinder than me.
Some I assume. But anyway, so like this point about like free markets would say that we should have either open borders or a one world state or some other articulation of this worldwide GDP. The Republican Party would not say that because it has other competing interests in its sort of platform. The other thing is I think maybe what ethical values Jared might be getting at, or at any rate they were coming to my mind, is a sort of long-term sustainability of a system. In a free market, you generally have individual decision makers making decisions for themselves and maybe their immediate posterity, their children, maybe. And they don't have a whole lot of, well, they have a lot of economic information theoretically, but they don't tend to have a lot of scientific information, a lot of the long-term ecological information that is pertinent to what they are doing. And that's not like immediately their fault. I think like some actors in our economy are well equipped to know, but they haven't been told. You know what I mean? You don't immediately think of the long-term ecological ramifications of your cattle farm. You're thinking of the money you can make from it, and that's the sort of thing I think central planning or regulation that sort of is approximate to, is somewhere in the realm in the ballpark of central planning that can do that, or it can, maybe doesn't, but can theoretically do that better.
Theoretically.
Yeah, so that's the kind of ethical failing capitalism or free markets can produce and have.
I think that's a great point to make. And if we had more time, or if I'm invited back again someday, then I might talk about two kind of key ideas related to your comments. One is the notion of externalities, and the other market failures. And I think there are some really important things to say about externalities and market failures in how big issues are handled. So there's a comment from Jared. And I think in particular, issues like global warming and so on. I think all of those are super duper important. And I think there are interesting things to say about them. But I can't do it now.
You'll most certainly be invited back next semester or something like that, because I know like 3 or 4 professors and you're one of them. So
now if you could do a little bit of Google hunting on the Dance of Reason site, and you could find a little essay I wrote there about market failures. I think it's called something like "Markets Fail, So What?" And you might find that interesting. And that would just be a taste.
All right. Do we have any other comments we want to commit to the recording, just in case it ever goes anywhere?
Just this one from me. Thanks very much. I enjoyed doing this.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you, Professor.
Thank
Of
you.
course.
Thank you. I enjoyed watching and listening to your presentation.
Hi, Gabriella.
All right. In that case, I'll go ahead and close this up and stop the recording. Thank you, those in attendance and those who may be watching at some time in the indistinct, vague future. Indistinct and uncertain. This has been the nth, so on and so forth, meeting of the CSUS Philosophy Club, and we will probably not be back next week on account of its finals time, and I'm already in over my head with this. But keep an eye on our discussion forum on Canvas. If you're on there, and if you're not, reach out to me about it. To see any discussion we may have in the future about maybe meeting up in the summer, only because it's an unofficial club, we're allowed to do that, as far as I know. Yeah, so probably this
Fingers up,
this will be the last
everybody.
sort of regular meeting of the semester.
Fingers up.
And I'm amazed which finger gets assigned to be the stinger. It's the pinky, but it doesn't
It
have
is
to
the
be
pinky, yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anyway, again, thank you all, and I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now. See you next time, probably next semester.